In 2024, I reviewed the Peugeot E-308 and I found it to be a little bit of a lackluster inclusion, specifically in the fully electric market. Its high asking price of roughly £40,000 to £43,000 and its relatively limited electric range did put me off. But step forward the new E-308, which on paper does have a pretty promising proposition. Here it's available at the time of filming and in the UK in 3 different trims, the Allure, the GT and the GT Premium, and also 3 different powertrains, hybrid, plug-in hybrid and fully electric, and it's also available in 2 different forms, in other words the hatch and also the SW model, which is the estate. Now in terms of its overall price tag, it's actually reduced over the previous generation model. Here, the fully electric hatchback model is available from roughly £31,000 to £34,000, while the estate is roughly £1,200 more. It's also worth considering that right now you've also got a £1,500 electric car grant, which also shaves down that price even further. And it's also worth highlighting over here that's in fact cheaper than the plug-in hybrid model, which is actually quite a rarity. Now in this review, which we covered in such a format, we'll see if it's actually worth its price tag, how it compares to its predecessor and also some of its competitors. Before proceeding, however, I would just like to point out that if you do want to find some of the best deals for it, make sure you check out the links down in the description below, the pinned comments, or by scanning the QR code that can be found on your screen. So to kick things off, let's talk about efficiency. And here, of course, you've got the regular hybrid model, which has got a pretty small battery pack. Useful, for example, if you're just going to be commuting and you have got no means of actually plugging it in. Then you've got the plug-in hybrid model, which has got a 17.2 kilowatt hour battery pack and a claimed fully electric range of 52 miles, at least on the WLTP mixed driving cycle. You've also got a 40-litre fuel tank, and therefore you should be able to net decent efficiency, at least if you can plug it in. Then, of course, you have got the fully electric model, which is what we're going to be concentrating on. Here you've got a 58.3 kilowatt hour battery pack, that is gross, and then you have got a WLTP mixed driving cycle claim of 275 to 279 miles. Now that's actually a roughly 25-mile improvement over the previous generation E-308. Now it's worth pointing out that yet again over here with a Stellantis vehicle, should you want a heat pump, you'll have to go for the top spec model. Thankfully, however, you can actually add in a heat pump in the cheaper trims, but it'll cost you an additional £400. Not too bad considering the overall price point, but I still would have preferred it to be included as standard across the entire trim range. Now nonetheless, in the vehicle that is on review, I actually netted a pretty impressive 190 to 210 miles. Now that's actually pretty much bang on what I would expect for the new E308 to achieve, because I got roughly 170 to 190 miles in the older generation model. So therefore that 25-mile claim that is supposedly been improved, well, it's exactly what I was able to notice in this vehicle and along my test routes, which were done on the motorway, the country roads and in and around the city. As you'll be able to see from the mileage leaderboard, it does actually fare relatively well, but yet again, very much like the E308 that just came before it, and of course some of the other vehicles from the Stellantis group, it doesn't exactly stand out over some of its rivals. Now another thing which I do appreciate in comparison to the older generation Stellantis vehicles is the fact that you've got customization when it comes to the regenerative braking feel. Here you've got paddle shifters which are found behind the steering wheel, and driving at roughly 100 kilometers an hour, if I were to lift off the accelerator pedal, the vehicle will feel like it's coasting, although there's still a small degree of regenerative braking. If, however, I want to heighten that feel, I can do so on the fly thanks to those paddle shifters, and if I were to flick over to the harshest mode and then lift off the accelerator pedal, the vehicle will feel like it's decelerating pretty harshly. Although it's worth pointing out over here that it will not come to a complete standstill, therefore you do not have a full one-pedal drive. Slightly disappointing, but I still do appreciate that Peugeot have incorporated that easy degree of customization, because it means that when you're on the motorway, you might want to just simply coast, and then if you are in and around the city, you might want to have a little bit of that extra aid from the electric motor, in other words, the regenerative braking feel, and therefore means that you don't have to resort to using the physical brake pedal all that much. Unsurprisingly, the fully electric model also has the means of being plugged in, and here you've got 100 kilowatts of input via its CCS port, allowing you to go from 20 to 80% in 30 minutes. There's also an 11 kilowatt onboard charger fitted as standard across the entire trim range, and therefore via Type 2 port you can go from 20 to 80% in 3 hours and 35 minutes. Opt for a regular wall box at 7 kilowatts, and this time goes up to 4 hours and 25 minutes, and for a 3-pin input it goes up to 14 hours and 40 minutes. So next up we get on to driving comfort, and first off, when it comes to the overall cabin noise, well, here I was actually pretty pleasantly surprised. When it came to driving on the motorway, there's very little amount of road noise, and there's very much little amount of wind that can be heard deflecting off the A-pillars or the wing mirrors. Sure enough, it's not exactly the utmost serene cabin that you can find out there on the market, but it's still actually pretty impressive, specifically given its overall price point and also some of its competitors. This is in part due to the fact that you have got an acoustically tinted and laminated windscreen. Of course, aside from this, a very important factor when it comes to the overall driving comfort is the suspension configuration. And here at the front you've got a Peugeot McPherson strut setup, while at the rear you have got semi-independent wheels with a twist beam axle. This effectively yields for a decent experience, albeit not perfect. On those winding country routes, it does hold itself pretty well by not giving you too much body lean, and when it came to just pottering around town, it has got a little bit of a harsher rebound over some bigger speed bumps or of course potholes. When it came to going on the motorway, it did a decent job of masking those anomalies. Effectively, it's not exactly the best, nor is it the worst, in that it's not going to compete with adaptive air suspension systems, which are normally found on much more expensive alternatives, but equally it doesn't find itself being too harsh, and therefore it's still actually a pleasurable driving experience. Another thing to consider are the overall driving dynamics, and here you have got that compact steering wheel, and therefore means it kind of incites you to drive faster, giving you that sort of go-kart feel. However, make no mistake, it doesn't give you that sort of one-to-one input with the front axle, despite being in terms of the sport mode preset. And this is just effectively due to the fact that the vehicle just doesn't feel as responsive as some of the sportier alternatives out there on the market. With that said, I had still a massive smile on my face when it came to chucking it around winding country routes, because the vehicle felt planted, didn't suffer from too much body lean, and of course with that small compact steering wheel, it meant that I had plenty of fun, and I suspect a lot of consumers would also do so. Now, what isn't going to set your world alight, namely in the fully electric market, is its overall performance. Because here you have got 115 kilowatts of power, or 156 horsepower, and 270 newton meters of torque. You'll be able to see how it compares to the regular hybrid and the plug-in hybrid, the latter being the most powerful out of the bunch. Nonetheless, I had the fully electric E-308 SW tested using RaceLogic's Performance Box Touch from 0 to 20 miles an hour in 2.44 seconds, 0 to 30 miles an hour in 3.68 seconds, 0 to 60 miles an hour in 8.71 seconds, which is actually faster than the manufacturer's claim, and 50 to 70 miles an hour in 4.51 seconds. I also record a peak acceleration of 0.38 G. As for its top speed, it depends in terms of which model you go for, but it should certainly suffice for the vast majority of consumers. So next up we get on to its interior design, and here I really do think it looks the part in terms of the use of materials that have been chosen around the dashboard, the door trims and also the center console, let alone when it comes to the stitching work and upholstery, namely in the top spec GT Premium. With that said, you will still find some harsh plastic towards the lower portion of the door trims and also the center console. Although given its overall price point, I can't complain all that much because it's very similar to some alternatives out there in the market, be it fully electric or not. Now, in terms of practicality, here it's great to see that the manufacturer has retained physical buttons and controls on the steering wheel. You have got those paddle shifters, which I did reference before, and you've also got traditional stalks. Towards the center console, you've got a small little dial which adjusts your drive mode and also your gear selector. And then you've also got a flurry of physical shortcuts which are just found by the dashboard. For example, towards your driver assistance systems and also the climate control. And above that, you've also got the customizable eye toggles, which I absolutely love. These effectively give you a shortcut to a certain part of the infotainment system, and it just makes it all that bit more intuitive to use. And given that it's customizable with the different apps that are provided, it means that you can pretty much customize it to your heart's content. As for the infotainment system itself, it's actually super responsive and also intuitively laid out. You've got a 10-inch size and therefore actually makes it relatively easy to see all your navigation or of course any sort of media that's playing back. It's also good to see that Android Auto and Apple CarPlay are supported over wired and wireless transmission. Then you've also got a 10-inch instrument cluster. And here it's also pretty customizable in terms of the different menus and also sub-menus that are displayed. Furthermore, in the top spec GT Premium, you'll also have a 3D effect, which might not be everyone's cup of tea, but I do like its overall dynamics because here it effectively gives you a little bit of an extra sort of context when it comes to, for example, your speedometer or your navigation. Apart from this, you do not have a head-up display, which is slightly disappointing because it would have added to the overall safety credentials by keeping your eyes planted on the road with all the key information that you require. Nothing that I can overly complain about, considering some of its competitors don't offer said option and its overall price point, namely in the fully electric market. Now, what I can critique, however, is the stock 6-speaker audio system. It doesn't do all that well across the sound frequency range. There is a lackluster amount of low-end bass, in other words that rumble, and also the mids, the vocals in other words, do actually sound pretty recessed and pushed back. Somewhat similar that I've said about some other Peugeot or Stellantis vehicles which also have a similar 6-speaker setup. I mentioned this as well because in the hybrid models, be it in the plug-in hybrid or the regular hybrid, and in the GT and the GT Premium trims, you do actually have the option of adding the Focal audio system within a pack. I'm not really sure why this has been omitted altogether in the fully electric 308, but it's just something that you should consider.
Next up we get onto storage, and here you've got the glove box, which is actually humongous, given the fact it does stretch all the way back, giving you plenty of room. Although I do suspect for right-hand drive vehicles it won't be as optimized, given the track record of other Stellantis products. Nonetheless, over here towards the center console, you've got a wireless charger, although that is optional in the GT and GT Premium trims only, and will set you back an additional £150, slightly disheartening. Towards the bottom of the center console, you'll find a small little area where there is a USB Type-C port to connect up to the infotainment system and a 12-volt socket to provide charge. There is another USB Type-C port that can be found within the center armrest compartment and two further ones that can be found at the rear of the center console, all of which provide charge only. Now, towards the middle of the center console, you have got two cup holders, and further down you've got an angled area which can be handy for placing a larger size smartphone. Then in terms of the center armrest compartment, it's actually pretty large and should accommodate smaller sized valuables. Now, of course, got the rear portion of the center console, which is relatively small, although will suffice for, let's say, a power bank or something similar. And then you have got the door bins. The front two will easily accommodate a 500ml bottle alongside some small to medium sized valuables, while the rear two are unsurprisingly a little bit more limited. It's worth noting over here that rear cup holders are present in the estate model, although here if you do want it in the hatchback models, it's only present in the GT trims. Now, of course, when it comes to storage, we have to talk about its boot capacity. And here in the fully electric hatchback model, you've got 361 litres to play around with, or 1,258 litres if you drop down the seats. This is going to be a lower figure in comparison to the regular hybrid and the plug-in hybrid models. Of course, if you do want to expand that space, and what you'll be able to see pictured is the SW, in other words, the estate. And here you have got 505 litres to play around with, or if you drop down the seats, 1,402 litres. Indeed, I do think it will suffice, and even for the regular hatchback model, it should be enough for your weekly shops. But of course, it might depend in terms of what you're actually shopping for. Now, in terms of practicality, you have got a hatchback design, which is certainly appreciated. You've also got an electric tailgate, which forms part of a £1,000 pack, and that can be found in the GT trim, although it becomes standard in the GT Premium. The seats themselves have got 60-40 rear split folding design, at least in the hatchback model, and 40-20-40 in the SW. You've also got a retractable and removable boot load cover. There's also a flat loading bay, making it very handy for loading in larger goods. There's also a small little underfloor compartment, which will suffice for taking your charging cables. Although it's worth noting that very much like other Stellantis vehicles, there is no front compartment, in other words, a storage area underneath the bonnet. But given the amount of size you've got at the rear of the vehicle, it's not something to overly complain about. Moving swiftly on, we get onto seating comforts, and I had no issues whatsoever at the front or rear of the cabin, at least where the seats themselves are concerned. They're very much accommodating and soft. Now the front two are heated as standard, and so is the steering wheel, although you have got manually operated seats only. If you, however, you want heated AGR certified driver seat with an 8-point massage and electronically operated driver seat, then you'll have to go for the GT Premium. This is quite disappointing that it's not present across the entire trim range. Now, as for the overall headroom and legroom, at the rear, it's a little bit limited. As someone who's just under 6 foot and being sat in the SW model, it just feels a little bit tight. And indeed, over here, in comparison to some of the other electric estates, of course, being at a much more premium price tag, they do offer better sort of rear occupancy space. Still, it'll suffice for younger children, and it's also very easy to access the rear of the vehicle. Therefore, if you're chucking in or out a car seat regularly, then it'll be a non-issue given due to the opening of the rear doors. Elsewhere, there is the option of adding a panoramic roof for £1,610 in the plug-in hybrid model, although this actually drops down considerably to £880 in the fully electric model. Handy, for example, if you want to draw in some nice light within the cabin. Handy, for example, for some of us who live in the UK and don't often have sunny climates. Next up, we get onto its exterior design, and here I had no complaints about the outgoing 308, but Peugeot has decided to spruce things up a little bit towards the front, side and rear and give it a little bit more of an aggressive flair, and I'm all for it. Towards the front, you have got slightly angled headlights which feed really nicely into the frontal grille, which is partly covered, at least if you're going for the fully electric model. Towards the side, you've got 18-inch alloys fitted as standard across the entire trim range, at least in the fully electric model. And it's also nice to see that you've got body-colored wheel arches and side skirts, which therefore give it a little bit more of a premium look. You've also got traditional door handles, making it very easy to access the vehicle from the exterior. As for the rear, you've got a really nice forward-thinking design with these slender-looking tail lights and a slight little lip which gives it a bit more of that sporty look to it. Frankly, I've got no complaints whatsoever, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts down in the comment section below. As for the colour options, it comes as standard in blue, which I actually quite like. However, if you want it in white, red, black or the pictured grey, you have to splash out an additional £750. On the subject of its exterior design, it brings me on to safety. And here, at the time of filming, it has not been tested by Euro NCAP, at least the modern 308, and therefore the rating validity has not been certified by Euro NCAP. However, if you do go back in 2022, they did test it and awarded it 4 out of 5 stars, scoring 76% in adult occupancy, 84% in child occupancy, and 65% in its safety assist scores. Now, nonetheless, should you believe or indeed use these scores as a means of determining if the vehicle is safe or not, we should talk about the driver assistance systems. And here, as standard, you've got adaptive cruise control with stop and go technology, which does actually work a treat by keeping you at a safe distance from the leading vehicle. It doesn't feel jerky either. You've also got automatic post-collision braking system, lane keeping assist, speed limit and traffic sign recognition and recommendation, driver attention warning, intelligent speed adaptation, and active safety brake. Now, should you want to go one step further, in the GT Premium, you'll also find rear cross traffic alert, blind spot detection, and lane position assist. This can also be added for £680 in the regular GT trim. Now, all these safety systems are very much appreciated and should keep you safer on the road. If, however, like me, you find them a little bit cumbersome, you might want to disable them. And thankfully, the manufacturers actually thought this through. By having the eye toggles or indeed the small little ADAS button, it allows you to quickly go onto the menu on the infotainment system and have some of the shortcuts that can be quickly disabled. So therefore, it does still mean that you have to faff around with the infotainment system, but it's not as cumbersome as some of its competitors. To wrap up this review, I would like to talk about parking and visibility. And towards the front, the positioning of the rear view mirror is a little bit further down for my liking, and as a result it does obstruct some of my frontal vision, but that can be a little bit subjective. Towards the side, you've got really nice wide windows, therefore making it easy to manually check your blind spot, and you've also got relatively slender A-pillars. Towards the rear, there's also a nice wide opening, and you've also got a wiper included, very much appreciated for those muddier terrain. Of course, it's unsurprising to learn that in the estate model, it's just a little bit harder to see your surroundings. But thankfully, here you have got rear parking sensors and a rear view camera that come fitted as standard across the entire trim range. Should you want front parking sensors, you'll have to go for the GT model, or if you want high resolution 360-degree cameras, you'll have to go for the GT Premium. With that said, these can actually be added in the Allure and the GT models respectively for an additional £680. And when it comes to parking and manoeuvrability, I had no issues whatsoever.
So with all that in mind, it brings us on to a verdict of the Peugeot E-308. And sure enough, it's not exactly perfect across the board, in that it could have been improved in a few different areas. The overall driving comfort, for example, the suspension system could have been a little bit more advanced. You could have get better set of features as standard across the entire trim range. For example, also a heat pump, which would have been appreciated on those colder climate days. And also in terms of its electric range and overall performance, well, it's not exactly going to set your world alight. With that said, given the overall price point that it comes in at, I do still think it's a worthwhile consideration. You're getting a pretty nice, stylish package, both inside and out, a decent electric range that should suffice for the vast majority of consumers, and also a pretty nice and practical design, namely if you're going for the fully electric estate, which, by the way, in the fully electric market is actually rather unique, and indeed there are fewer and fewer fully electric estates available on the market, especially at this sort of price point. As a result of all of this, I definitely can see myself recommending it, and as such, it gets our Best Buy award. Now, I'd be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below, and if you would pick it over some rival alternatives. If you've enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing, and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Chris from TotallyEV, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.